Hello and welcome to my series of conversations with men and women whose ideas, vision and philosophy help define our contemporary world. My guest today is heir to a rich spiritual heritage, relatively young, 60-odd years old, that has embraced a deep spirituality with a profound social conscience that has reached out to millions of people around the world, not just through the teachings and practice of its philosophy and meditation, its techniques, but a profound commitment to social action. She is the director of the European wing of the Spiritual University of the Brahma Kumaris. I'm delighted to welcome Sister Jayanti.
Hello and Om Shanti, a greeting of peace.
Thank you. You start with a greeting of peace. Ordinarily in the world, we're sort of obsessed with the notion of happiness. In your tradition, what is the notion of happiness?
Just as I said Om Shanti, there are some people who would say Om Kushi. Mm-hmm. So yes, happiness is a very important thermometer of the well-being of the soul. So we would value it greatly. Because when I say happiness, then I mean that there's a state of fulfillment, a state of contentment, a state in which I'm comfortable with myself and I'm comfortable in my relationships with those around me. So happiness is one of the ways in which we can, in a sense, measure how well we are doing in terms of understanding the self, exploring the relationship with the divine, and doing the things that we need to do in the world in the right, just and accurate way.
But very often the notion of comfortableness is seen as indifference, is seen as passivity, and we're not always sort of, we don't feel the pain and the suffering of others. And there are traditions which sort of recommend a degree of discomfort, so there is the impetus to action in order to serve other people. So what is the idea of comfortableness?
Maybe there's a few different stages that I'd like to describe. One is a stage of uncaring, and in the streets of London you'll find somebody who's fallen and there'll be 100 people who will walk past and not even bother to stop. And maybe after 100 have gone by, one individual will stop and say, "Can I do something to help you?" So that's a condition of many places in the world today, not just the city in which I live, but many other places too. So that, of course, is a state of inhumaneness, a state in which humanity has lost its soul in a sense. Then you've got a state where I see you suffering and I feel for you and I empathize, but I also cry. And yes, okay, I'm feeling that empathy and I want to reach out, but I don't have the capacity to try and do something to help you. And then there's another state in which I see your suffering, but I'm able to maintain my own awareness of reality of the self, the eternal self, my relationship with the divine, and in that state, I can reach out and wipe away your tears. If I didn't have that inner state of joy within my own being, and I was in a state of suffering and tears, I could do nothing to help you at that moment. And so I would say that just as you described our organization as one of social activism, it's an interesting description, and yes, I would agree with that we're very concerned about the ills of society and what it is we can do to try and sort them out and reform them and put them right again. And my own inner state of well-being and happiness is paramount in this, because it's with that inner strength that then I can do something to help another.
You know, within the confines of a short television program, let me just sort of attempt to sort of lead you into a basic understanding of what and who the Brahma Kumaris are. And you had Brahma Baba, who sort of was a jewelry businessman, who had a revelation and an experience and founded this order to share and transmit that insight and that understanding. Very often, in the faiths that have had revelations, tend to be less accepting, perhaps, less tolerant. I'm not saying that is the case with the Brahma Kumaris. In fact, I think that you are celebrated for your interfaith dialogue and the relationships you have with other traditions. But there is this notion in your tradition of the revelation of, in a sense, implicitly Judgment Day too, that this is Kali Yuga, and a day will come when there will be the brimstone and fire, and there will be a new beginning, and people's actions and karmas will catch up with them. Is this a fair sort of description? And I think the other element that's an important one from the outside is the apparently dominant role of women. And though the primary inspiration, the founder in a sense, was male and a dada, it's really the dadis who run and manage the outfit. What is the significance of the dadis?
Yes, absolutely true that the visions that Brahma Baba had, one was a vision of God as a being of light. No physical form, no angelic form, just light. And it was a different concept to what he was accustomed to. He had been brought up as a traditional Hindu, worshipping, following the path of devotion. He was in fact a worshipper of Vishnu. But when he had this vision of God as a being of light, he knew intuitively, instinctively, that this is the being, the supreme, that he had to connect with. Another vision was of the transformation and the upheaval of the present modern world, and then the world settling down, and out of that then a new world beginning. A world in which there were human beings, but human beings filled with light, with divinity, human beings who had reached the higher state of their own potential, so that they were expressing divine qualities in their lives. And he pondered deeply on what he had seen, and he understood that a new world was possible, a world that was filled with love, with truth, with peace, with justice, and it could happen only through a transformation of the human heart.
But are you the chosen to lead that process of transformation of the human heart?
You and I together, each one of us within the world who chooses to experience that relationship with the divine and makes themselves available as an instrument for that light.
Are you acknowledging, in a sense, of other parts, other traditions, towards social conscience, of caring for the other people, of being a good human being? Is that enough too, or is it necessary or useful or or expedient to believe in this particular vision of God as light, in order for whenever Judgment Day comes, in many traditions it doesn't exist, but should it happen, that if you have practiced and the virtuous life, perhaps, of compassion and love, would that be enough?
The image that I hold in my mind is the image of a tree, and how every single branch of the tree is important and relevant. And if you were to chop away any one of the branches, the tree would be disfigured. And so I would say that all the different paths that human beings follow, all the different traditions, are part of that beautiful tree of humanity. And my understanding would be that there's one seed of that tree, and that seed is the being who is the supreme. So yes, I would feel that it's important to have a relationship with the divine, but then whichever branch it is you're following, it's absolutely fine. But the connection has to be with the roots, with the seed.
What about agnosticism then?
I think that at some point within their journey, they too will come to an awareness now. Who knows? But that would be my sense, that there has to come a point at which the heart is able to open and is able to understand and realize.
You're watching a conversation with Sister Jayanti, the director of the European wing of the Brahma Kumaris Spiritual University. We'll be right back after a short break. Don't go away. Welcome back to a continuing conversation with Sister Jayanti from the Brahma Kumaris. There's sort of the unanswered question of the role of women and the dominant role of women in the organization. Did that have a social significance in some ways? Does that still have that same significance?
I think so.
And what is it?
In 1937, when Brahma Baba founded the Spiritual University, one of the things that he felt very strongly was that if you were to create a better world, then it had to be through equality. It had to be through a transformation in which there was justice again once more. And today you would describe it as affirmative action. So he decided very consciously to give the role of teachers and leaders to women. And so that's when it started way back then. And if you think about the state of the subcontinent at that time especially, it was quite a revolutionary, pioneering step to take. But on another level, he also recognized that women have the ability to nurture and sustain. And on the path of spirituality and transformation, that particular quality is very important and significant. And then through the years, of course, it's been very important that women have come to the understanding of their own inner dignity, their own state of self-respect, so that they can come to that state where they are able to share on an equal level. It's not a question of one in front of the other or anyway, but working together in partnership together. And today I would say that in the 21st century, one of the words that's being used is this whole idea of feminine energy. And so many people would say that what the world needs now is, we've had the macho part, we've had the masculine energy of aggression, of conquest, of fighting, but now that needs to be balanced with the qualities of love, of tolerance, of patience. So we would say that the soul is neither male nor female, but has the capacity of both qualities. And then depending on the form that it adopts, then according to that gender, those qualities are nurtured by society. But at this point where there is more or less, I would still say more or less, not completely, there is a platform in which all can share in an equal way.
So what is the relationship of this tradition to masculinity, in a sense? Two sort of interwoven questions, because implicit in that is also sexuality, and the Brahma Kumaris recommend or urge celibacy in the community. How does that dovetail with sort of evolutionary processes? The continuation of the species. How do you relate to that?
If I look at the whole history of religion and what's happened through the last few thousand years, it's been a very patriarchal system. And so I think that definitely needs to be thrown out of the window at this point, so that it's acknowledged that men and women are souls, and neither one of them can be overbearing and authoritarian and have control over the other. So that's a very important aspect to understand. And then in terms of the present conditions of the world, if you think about a person like Mahatma Gandhi and his advocacy of celibacy, it was more with that awareness that if you were to harness your own inner power, then you'd be able to use that inner strength to do something that was constructive for the world at large. And so we believe that we're going through a very, very critical time in human history.
But is this idea of celibacy, for the chosen, which means the 800,000 who are, who wear white, and even if not every day, but are sort of formal followers of the faith, if this were to be a universal ideal, that would be the end of the planet.
I think at this moment where the world is facing a true crisis, whether it's in terms of population explosion, whether it's in terms of the energy crisis, whether it's in terms of climatic change, all of these things are saying to me that there's something we need to do differently. And that is not just focus on our own personal needs and comforts and the way we do things as we've always done for thousands of years, but it's actually a moment in which, as a human family, we can choose to do something else. And what we can do is to say, okay, let's pause, let's stop, and now at this moment see what is it that the world needs. And definitely celibacy, purity would be of great advantage to humanity at this moment for any number of different reasons.
You have done a great deal of work personally and institutionally in the area of interfaith dialogue and the meeting ground, in a sense, between traditions. Very often there is a temptation, you used the analogy of the tree earlier, to really focus on the similarities perhaps and to pretend even that all religions really ultimately teach the same thing. But in everyday experience, it is really diversity. And I mentioned agnosticism. There are people who think very, very differently. And their life's experiences and their practices are different. And there's a great deal of diversity. And so this search for unity is often very syncretic. It seems artificial and forced because we have to be polite to each other. What for you is the basis of interfaith dialogue that can move beyond religious leaders appearing on a platform and saying wonderful things about each other's traditions, particularly of respect? But in practice, that is not the everyday experience of people who are at war because they don't believe in each other's traditions.
What I've found is that if I come to the awareness of my own spiritual identity, and that doesn't matter which tradition you belong to, because every tradition will recognize that there's a spiritual aspect to the human being. So when I come to the spiritual awareness of who I am, I'm able to maintain my own inner state of respect and dignity. And in that state of self-respect, I can see you in the same way as a spiritual being and treat you with dignity and respect, no matter what your other beliefs and customs and food habits and clothes and everything else, no matter what else there may be. But the connection will then be a spiritual connection of soul to soul. And so that is the foundation for being part of a human family. One of the things that's been found by research, and in particular it was research taken by the University of Minnesota way back in the 80s, they found that where there was self-esteem, there was less discriminatory behavior. And where there was lack of self-esteem, there was discriminatory behavior. So I see that the fundamental factor is actually, the reason is that we don't know our own tradition. And so because we don't have the spiritual understanding of the path to which I actually belong, we lack that inner self-respect and dignity, and then there's discrimination outside. And so I think that, especially at this time when the whole world on a global level is highly materialistic, and it doesn't matter which religion you belong to, materialism, consumerism are the words of today. And so, this word consumerism, it's interesting, it consumes you. And that's what happens when you're consumed by material desires. You've lost yourself, you've lost your identity. And so I think that interfaith dialogue is awakening that faith within one's own tradition and the adherence to those spiritual principles that are at the heart of a particular tradition.
Much of the sort of, the modern notions of society and the planet ostensibly relate to scientific empiricism, which is frequently either looked at as being at odds with spirituality, or again, a very syncretic kind of bringing together and saying, well, these are the conclusions of modern science, but the ancient scriptures have said this, and looking for equivalence. How do you view, because much of the things that we talk about, the soul, divinity, Judgment Day, or however we choose to describe it, don't stand up to the processes of scientific scrutiny, which is in fact the dominant discourse in our times. How do you view the processes of science?
What I've been seeing is that science has actually been moving along, and it's now come to the point where it's very, very easy for scientists to understand that there is something called consciousness. 25 years ago, it might have been a different story, but today there's any number of very eminent scientists who are exploring the whole dimension of consciousness. And one of the things that's happened again in the last 20 years is research into what's called the near-death experience, and how, although the heart seems to have stopped, the brain seems to have stopped functioning, yet somebody is able to have an experience out of the body and come back and report absolutely whatever it is that was going on at that time that they were supposed to have been dead. And so the conclusion from that seems to be that consciousness is separate from brain, consciousness is separate from the body, and so consciousness has an identity which is its own very unique factor. And so I think that as we go further, scientists are actually going to be able to prove to the world, and yes, today, science is God, research is God, and so people are going to be able to have the evidence that they are seeking, to be able to know things of the spiritual dimension. For example, one of the things that spiritual people always believed in is the power of thought, the power of vibration.
Do you see spiritual people in some ways perhaps as being, I hate to use the word, but let's say superior?
I see spiritual beings, spiritual people as being more in touch with reality. I wouldn't say superior, but more in touch with reality. And people who haven't yet discovered spirituality as being locked into a very limited frame in which they're not able to understand things that are part of human experience and
life.
What
about the political, the framework, the framework of political ideology? How do the Brahma Kumaris relate to issues such as, say, secularism, or secularism as we understand it in India, and the political process that seems to circumscribe much of religion?
One of the things that I know very little about the politics of India,
the United
I have
Kingdom
to say that.
Or Europe, but the principle of it.
But one of the things that has happened through secularism, especially in terms of education structures, is that values and the education in terms of a culture of values has disappeared. And I think we're beginning to see very tragic results of that. And I think that what's happening now, again worldwide, is that there's a recognition that there has to be some way of being able to impart an education in values.
Is that possible independent of religion or faith?
Yes.
And dare I even add spirituality?
Okay, you've used many different words and they all have a different connotation.
Yes.
As soon as you start talking about values, and people today are recognizing the lack of values in healthcare, the lack of values in politics, in education, in business, you name it.
So we frequently use the notion of secular values. What do we mean by secular values?
I wonder. I actually wonder. But I'm talking about the values that would be described as human values. Respect and honesty and love and these things. Responsibility.
But there are traditions which consider that, even Buddhism in some ways, that if the motive is right, then sometimes violence may be legitimate. Gandhi would say, no, that isn't the case. And I'm not deliberately sort of using the perceptions of Islam and many other traditions. So there really isn't, when it comes down to the generalizations that society tends to need or we want to reassure ourselves with, there is great diversity, and ultimately this is subject and circumscribed by the political system that governs at any given time. And so this relationship between religion and politics has become in many ways inescapable. Whether it is the secularism as defined in the United States, or secularism in India, or multiculturalism in the United Kingdom. So how do you see this relationship between politics, political structures and religion? Should people like yourself to stay away from the political process, or might you offer yourself for election one day? I don't mean you individually, but...
There's a very simple definition of politics that I loved when I first heard it. And it was by Mahatma Gandhi, that as soon as you start having a relationship with your neighbor, that's politics. And so in that sense, how we connect with each other, how the governance of a particular system works, that I think is very much based on the subject of values, and where the world has become very materialistic everywhere. then I think that we've lost out a great deal. And so it's important to get back to the subject of values, but as soon as you start talking about values, where do values lie? Values are not here or here. Values are in the soul.
Or here.
Okay, and here is the pump, the machine. But the feelings are actually in here, in the soul. And when the soul is gone, the values and the feelings have gone with it. So it's here, actually. And so I think that, yes, values open the door to the understanding of things beyond materialism. And so it's a very important subject. And I think where we've ignored the spiritual dimension of life, this is where we've lost values, and this is why we see the sort of fundamentalism that we see today.
Is it possible for you to give us a brief taste of a meditation or a process that
Sure.
Would take us closer, give us a closer insight? And I shan't keep talking and deprive you of time, but give us an insight into what the Brahma Kumaris represent.
Okay. I'm going to ask the viewers to sit quietly and just let the body relax and sit still. I'm going to speak out my own thoughts as I move into the awareness of meditation, and I invite you to follow those ideas. I visualize my own spiritual identity. I come back to the awareness of who I am. I, a being of light, in the center of the forehead. I am a soul. I journey inwards, and the speed of my thoughts slows down, and on the screen of my mind, I hold one thought, the thought of peace. And in this awareness, I begin to feel peace within my own being. Peace is who I am. This is my natural state of being. And in this awareness of peace, I feel the sacred presence of the Divine, the Supreme, the Being of Light, the light of love, the light of truth, the light that protects and heals and shares all blessings.
Thank you very much for sharing this experience with us.
Thank you.